Welcome to this episode, folks. Today we're diving deep into a provocative take on the New Testament, where it's suggested that everything, including Jesus' hometown, might be a second century invention.
That's right. We're looking at arguments saying the Gospel of Mark is more of a theological fiction than a historical account.
Exactly. And central to this discussion is R.G. Price, though not a familiar name outside of certain circles. His claim, as I understand it, is that the Gospel of Mark wasn't just edited slightly, it was like heavily rewritten to suit ever-changing Orthodox agendas.
It's certainly a radical claim, suggesting that what we commonly believe about Jesus is basically, a literary construct.
Right, and it goes even further. Price argues that there's no authentic eyewitness testimony or oral tradition backing these Gospels. Instead, they're literary mimicries that align with Jewish scriptures and even Paul's theology.
Yeah, that's pretty compelling. So, if I understand correctly, the argument is that the Gospels were essentially shaped by later editors to match a unified theological narrative.
Absolutely. Take Jesus' hometown, for example. You know how we always say Jesus of Nazareth? Price contends that, in the original Gospel of Mark, there's no indication that Jesus was from a specific town called Nazareth. Instead, Nazarene might have been derived from the Hebrew Nazir, referring to holy or consecrated figures.
And this reinterpretation, where Nazarene becomes from Nazareth, seems like an editorial fix to harmonize the narrative between Gospels like Matthew and Luke.
Exactly. It's almost as if editors, trying to smooth out inconsistencies, retroactively inserted these details. And it's not just a theory. Scholars like René Salm and even Bart Ehrman have pointed out the lack of solid evidence for a significant settlement in Nazareth at that time.
Indeed. So, Price suggests that the portrayal of Jesus, including his background and even his ministry, might not be based on actual historical events, but rather constructed to fit a particular theological mold.
That's the big picture. His thesis: the Gospels are more like theological allegories than historical biographies. And there's an argument that there's an early version of Luke, a proto-Luke, if you will, that didn't reference Nazareth at all.
Yeah, interesting. So this proto-Luke, along with a similar version of Acts, was later revised when the Orthodox canon was being solidified in the 2nd century.
Exactly. The editing process was like patching together different narratives. Not only does Price argue that Mark was revised, but even the Gospel of John underwent its own orthodoxization. Originally, it was more, Gnostic, abstract, and away from physical details. Then later, references to Nazareth were added to align it with the Synoptic Gospels.
And that kind of raises questions about the integrity of these texts. Like, if we're being honest, isn't it a bit unsettling to think that what we hold as sacred history might actually be a patchwork of editorial decisions?
Absolutely. It's like, imagine crafting a puzzle from scratch, but then someone comes along and decides the pieces need to fit a new picture entirely. Price's argument undermines the traditional notion that these are
right.
Divinely
Although I'm not
inspired
entirely
documents.
sold that it's purely editorial. A bit too neat, don't you think? Yeah. I mean, I agree that the scholarly approaches introduce compelling points, but there's still room to debate whether these editorial changes were as systematic and deliberate as Price suggests.
That's a fair critique. I mean, Price goes so far as to say that these Gospels weren't just refined, but created from inspirations drawn from Jewish scripture and the writings of Paul. He even rejects the widely accepted Q source theory, arguing that there's no Q at all.
I've heard that. Instead, he posits that there's this proto-Luke and proto-Acts, which were then revised to produce what we've got in the canon.
Exactly. It's like saying the Orthodox versions we know today are essentially the result of a meticulous revision process aimed at creating consistency across the Gospels. Now here's where it gets really explosive. If this is all true, then all of our assumptions about the historical Jesus become highly questionable.
Right, no kidding. It really makes you wonder. Are we looking at genuine historical documents or a legendary narrative built for political and theological purposes?
Precisely. And Price's perspective challenges the entire foundation of New Testament history by suggesting that we're dealing with, literary constructions rather than factual accounts.
Yeah, that's pretty provocative. And I mean, if we consider the example of Jesus' supposed hometown, the transformation from Nazarene to from Nazareth, this touches on how even minor details might be fabrications.
Exactly. Think about it. The original text likely had different implications that got lost in translation. It's like if you had a recipe and then someone, added ingredients later to suit new tastes, you've got a completely different dish.
That's a good analogy. But isn't it also possible that these changes were made to reconcile the variant traditions already circulating at the time? I mean, there could have been an organic process of harmonization.
That's a valid counterpoint. It might not have been so conspiratorial as deliberate manipulation. Perhaps it was, a natural evolution of storytelling to suit the community's needs. However, Price seems intent on highlighting the extent and intentionality of these editorial decisions.
Right, I get that. Now, what about the implications for our understanding of historical Jesus? If these accounts are indeed crafted allegories, then can we confidently distinguish historical facts from theological fiction?
That's the million-dollar question. Price's thesis implies that the very existence of a historical Jesus as depicted in the Gospels becomes questionable. It's suggesting that the building of his persona, his ministry, crucifixion narrative, even the Galilean roots was constructed and refined over time.
That shakes up the traditional view indeed. It does. And it's fascinating because it doesn't just rely on archaeological silence about Nazareth. It also dissects the internal textual evolutions, like the differing spellings and terms used in Luke.
Exactly. The multiple variants, like Nazarios, Nazarenos, Nazareth, are evidence of a tentative process by the editors who weren't quite sure of the right term until the Orthodox version solidified.
Right, exactly. And then when it comes to John, the transformation from a more mystical, Gnostic text to a version riddled with geographic references, that seems like another clear example of reframing the narrative for a unified doctrine.
Absolutely. It's all about creating a cohesive story that fits the theological agenda of the time. Price's upcoming book promises to delve even deeper, showing how every gospel is more like a literary allegory than a straightforward historical account.
So, if everything we believe is, in some ways, a product of second-century editorial decisions, what does that mean for modern faith communities?
That's a big philosophical challenge. It invites believers and scholars alike to re-examine the narratives we accept as historical. It could potentially lead to a more nuanced view of Scripture, seeing it as literature imbued with theological intent rather than a strict documentary record.
And I guess that means questioning long-accepted details, like the existence of Nazareth as a historical town. If archaeological data is weak, it fuels Price's argument further.
Yes, it does. Price's work spurs us to consider that maybe the details of Jesus' life are a combination of earlier traditions and later systematic editing, but, while certainly compelling, not everyone in the scholarly community is on board with this wholesale revision.
That's the crux of the debate. Right, I mean, some critics argue that expecting a fully coherent, unaltered historical record from ancient texts is a bit, unrealistic. They contend that evolution in texts is natural.
True. But Price challenges us to recognize that the revisions, especially those that drastically change the meaning, like turning Nazarene into from Nazareth, are not just natural variations, but possibly deliberate maneuvers to match a predetermined narrative.
And that deliberate aspect is what makes his thesis so explosive. If these are intentional fabrications, then the unified image of Jesus we know might be entirely a product of, constructed literature rather than history.
Exactly. It forces us to ask tough questions like, if the gospel stories are essentially literary constructs, then what remains of their historical core? And more broadly, how do we interpret sacred texts when faced with evidence of, elaborate editorial intervention?
Right on. It definitely gives us a lot to chew on, rethinking tradition, history, and the nature of religious texts itself.
Absolutely. And whether you agree with Price or not, it's a reminder of the complexity behind these ancient texts, how what we take for granted was subjected to myriad revisions and influences over centuries.
No doubt. This conversation really underscores how essential it is to question everything we think we know, right? Even the foundations of religious history might, be more fluid than we assume.
Exactly. And while it might unsettle some, it also opens up a richer, more critical way of engaging with our past. Price's insights, provocative as they are, remind us that history is often a tapestry of many voices and revisions.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, this was quite a journey. From discussing the evolution of the gospel texts to questioning the reality of Jesus' hometown. It's, a lot to think about, and definitely challenges established narratives.
For sure. Keep questioning, keep exploring, and let's embrace the mystery as much as the knowledge. Thanks for tuning in, everyone.
Indeed, thanks for the deep dive.